She was 20 years old, and by the cold measure of the world, homeless. She had no family left, no roof that bore her name, no coin saved beyond what fit in a folded handkerchief. The man who cast her out was Thaddeus Wexler, land agent for the Hollow Creek Bank, and the reason he gave was written on a single sheet of ruled paper. An unpaid note, 3 years overdue, that he said her late father had signed and never honored. She did not remember the note. She remembered only that her father had died coughing into a rag by the stove, and that within a week of the burial, Wexler's boots had been on her porch, a folder under his arm, and a smile that did not reach his eyes, the same practiced smile she would later understand that had likely opened 100 other doors before hers with the same cold, unhurried certainty. He left her $19, the exact sum the bank allowed for what he called relocation courtesy, and a single afternoon to gather what she could carry. With that $19 less the 5 she spent on train fare and bread, she arrived 3 days later in the town of Cutter's Ridge, where a county auctioneer stood on a crate in front of a sagging, ivy-choked house and sold it to her, sight near unseen, for $14. The house had a name in that country, spoken low and half-lawing. The Bellamy Orchard House, cursed, folks said, because the last man who owned it had died alone inside it, and no one could say why. Every man in that crowd thought she was a fool to spend her last coins on a place the town would sooner have seen burned to the foundation than lived in. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that sealed inside the crumbling brick of that house's chimney was a truth that would not only feed her through the coming winter, but would tear loose the roots of the very man who had put her out on the road, and give a forgotten town something it had not had in a decade, a reason to trust its own soil again. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Mercer. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us where, in the comments below. Eliza had been born in Hollow Creek, Missouri, in a clapboard house at the edge of the Mercer Orchard, in a spring so wet that her mother used to say the whole valley smelled of green apples before the trees had even set fruit, a smell Eliza herself would spend years afterward trying, without quite meaning to find again in every orchard she ever walked through. Her mother did not live past Eliza's 7th year, taken by a fever that swept the valley 2 winters running, and what Eliza kept of her afterward was less a clear memory than a handful of small, certain fragments, the particular way she hummed while kneading bread, the smell of dried lavender she kept in a jar on the windowsill, the sound of her voice reading aloud from the same small Bible Eliza would later carry out of Hollow Creek in her canvas bag. And after that it was her father, Elias Mercer, and her father's father, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Obadiah, who raised her between them in the rhythm of orchard work and the smell of curing wood. It was Obadiah who taught her everything that mattered. He was not a farmer by first trade, but a joiner, a builder of cabinets and door frames, and the fine-fitted staircases that the wealthier houses in the county wanted, and he kept a workshop behind the orchard barn that smelled of linseed oil and fresh-cut oak shavings. A smell Eliza would carry in her memory for the rest of her life the way other people carried the memory of a hymn. He taught her to read the grain of a board the way a sailor reads weather, to know by running 2 fingers along a plank whether it would warp before the year was out. He taught her the patient language of a mortise and tenon joint, how a tenon must be shaved down in small, unhurried passes, never forced, and until it married its mortise with a resistance just short of stubborn, so that when it was finally driven home with the flat of a mallet, it would hold for 100 years without a drop of glue. The dull, satisfying thwack of wood meeting wood, a sound she came to love above almost any other in that workshop. He taught her to listen to wood the way other men listened to horses, to hear the difference between a board that was merely dry and one that was ready. On winter evenings, he would sit her on an upturned crate by the stove and let her run a rag soaked in beeswax and turpentine over the handle of his oldest chisel, a half-inch bench chisel with a beech handle, gone the color of strong tea from 40 years of his own hands, and he would tell her that a tool cared for outlives the man who cares for it, and passes something of him along to whoever holds it next. It was that chisel worn smooth in the exact places where his grip had always fallen, that he pressed into her palm on the last clear-headed evening of his life before the illness that had been eating quietly at his lungs for 2 years. finally closed its hand around him. The illness had announced itself slowly, a cough that would not clear through 2 winters, a shortness of breath that turned the walk from the house to the workshop, once nothing, into something he had to pause and rest through halfway. He kept working as long as his hands would let him, finishing a set of cabinet doors for the Odell's new parlor with breath that whistled faintly in his chest between each careful pass of the plane, refusing to leave a job half done even as the job itself grew harder to finish. Eliza spent that last autumn splitting her days between school lessons her father insisted she keep, and long afternoons in the workshop, simply sitting near her grandfather, sanding scraps he no longer had the strength to sand himself, listening to him name tools and joints and grains of wood in a voice grown thinner but no less certain. He did not die in violence or accident. He died the way an old tree comes down in the end, slowly, from the inside, in his own bed, with Eliza's hand in his and her father's standing in the doorway, unable to make himself come closer. Save it for something worth building, he told her, meaning the chisel, and she did not fully understand what he meant until years later, in a house 200 miles from the one he'd built with his own hands. There were other lessons that autumn and the autumns before it that she would only recognize as lessons much later, once she had left the valley and had nothing left of her grandfather but memory to consult. He taught her to square a corner with nothing but a framing square and a patient eye, to true a warped board over the edge of the workbench with steady, even pressure rather than force, to drive a nail at the correct angle so that 2 boards drew tight together, instead of splitting apart under the hammer's blow. He taught her that varnish applied too thick would craze within a season, and that the secret of a lasting finish was thin coats, many of them, each rubbed back before the next was laid. Patience disguised as a kind of stubbornness. He kept a coffee tin of bent nails on the windowsill, straightened one at a datum on slow evenings, because a nail wasted, he said, was no different from $1 wasted, and a joiner who respected his materials would never want for materials to respect. Eliza observed these small economies, the way a child absorbs a language, without ever quite noticing she was learning it, until the words and the habits were simply hers, indistinguishable from her own thinking. On Sundays, when the workshop was closed and the orchard quiet, Obadiah would sometimes walk her along the tree rows and name each variety by the particular curl of its bark or the shape of its leaf before the fruit had even set. Baldwins and northern spies and a stand of old Rambos that had been there, he said, since before the county had a name, and he taught her that an orchard, like a joint, wanted patience above all else, that a tree pruned in haste bore poorly for years afterward, while one shaped slowly, season upon season, would outlive the hand that shaped it. His death took more from the household than affection. It took the one voice in the county that other men had listened to, the one presence at the table when papers came round that made bank agents mind their manners and keep their offers honest. Elias Mercer was a fine orchardist and an honest man, but he was not a reader of contracts, and in the 2 years after his father's death, as the orchard's yield dipped through a run of hard frosts, he began to sign what was put in front of him by men who assured him it was standard practice, a form, a formality, nothing to trouble himself over. Among those men was Thaddeus Wexler, newly installed as the Hollow Creek Bank's land agent, a narrow, precise man who wore his collar buttoned to the throat even in August, and kept a ledger book bound in dark leather that he carried the way other men carried a sidearm. Wexler did not raise his voice ever. In the 2 years Eliza watched him do business in that town, he did not need to. He had discovered, or perhaps always understood, that a man with a ledger and a calm voice could take more from a family in an afternoon than a man with a gun could take in a year, and that the law, more often than not, would stand at his shoulder while he did it. The end came on a gray morning in October, not long after Elias himself had been buried beside his father, under the 2 young maples at the edge of the orchard. Wexler arrived unannounced, as he always did, with a folder under his arm and a clerk trailing a half step behind him carrying a satchel of forms. He did not sit. He stood in the front room where Obadiah's chisels had once hung in their careful row on the wall, and he opened the folder and turned it so that Eliza could see her father's signature at the bottom of a promissory note dated 3 years past, a note for an amount that seemed, to Eliza's eye, larger than any sum her father had ever spoken of owing. When she said as much, that she did not believe her father would have signed for a debt never mentioned, Wexler did not argue with her. He set the folder down on the table between them with the deliberate care of a man laying out cards he already knew would win, and said that he understood grief made people doubt what they did not wish to be true, but that a signature, once witnessed and dated, did not require a family's belief to remain binding. When Eliza asked evenly whether he had ever once seen her father's hand write anything so careless as the scrawl at the bottom of that note, Wexler only tilted his head, the faintest suggestion of a smile at the corner of his mouth, and told her that a bank did not employ him to admire penmanship, only to enforce it. He simply closed the folder and said, in the same even voice he might have used to comment on the weather, that sentiment was not a form of currency the bank accepted, and that a debt did not require a family's memory to be valid, only a signature and a date. He told her the note was being called due in full, that the orchard and the house upon it were forfeit to the bank as of that morning, and that as a courtesy, given the family's long standing in the county, he was prepared to offer her $19, and until sundown to remove whatever she could carry. He said it the way a man reads a weight from a scale. Eliza did not weep. She did not raise her voice or ask him a second time to explain the note, because she understood, with a clarity that surprised her even as she felt it settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, that there was nothing in that room that would move him, that his calm was not cruelty exactly, but something colder, an absence of the very idea that it could be cruelty at all. She went instead to the workshop, took down her grandfather's chisel from its hook, wrapped it in a square of oiled cloth, and packed it at the bottom of a canvas bag, along with 2 dresses, a tin cup, her mother's small Bible, and what food she could carry. The clerk who trailed Wexler through the house that afternoon, tallying what furniture the bank would claim against the note, paused once at the workshop door and asked, almost gently, whether she wanted to keep any of the tools, and it was Wexler himself who answered before she could, saying that tools not accounted for in the estate were the bank's property same as the lumber, and that sentiment, again, was not a line item the ledger recognized. Eliza said nothing to that either. She simply closed her hand around the one tool already in her possession, and did not open it again until she was a mile down the road, walking with her chin level and her back straight, because whatever else Wexler had taken from her, she was determined he would not also take the manner of her leaving. She walked out the front door of the only house she had ever lived in without once looking back at Wexler, who stood in the doorway watching her go with the same flat patience he might have shown watching a debt column finally balanced to zero. The road south to Cutter's Ridge took 3 days, and Eliza walked most of it, riding when a passing wagon offered space and refusing when the price of the ride was more than she could spare. The first day, the country still belonged to Hollow Creek in spirit if not in name, green and close, orchard rows giving way to pasture, giving way to stands of hickory and oak, still holding their late-season color, the air thick with the smell of turned earth and wood smoke drifting from farmhouse chimneys. She slept the first night in the lee of a hayrick with her bag beneath her head and the chisel wrapped against her chest like something living that needed to be kept warm. By the second day, the land had begun to change. The grass thinning, the trees growing sparser and more twisted, the soil turning the color of rust where the rock showed through, and she understood without being told that she was walking out of one country and into another, that the valley she had known her whole life was closing behind her the way a door closes, quietly and completely. The wind carried different smells now, dust and dry grass, and, once, very faintly, the mineral tang of a creek running low over stone. She passed fewer farms and more fences with no cattle behind them, more houses with their boarded against a wind that had nothing left to keep out. She rode part of the second day in the bed of a farmer's wagon loaded with cordwood, jolting over ruts hard enough to bruise, listening to the farmer and his wife talk between themselves about a dry summer and a creek running low. And when they set her down at a crossroads and would not take her offered coin, saying only that a girl walking alone deserved what small kindness the road could offer, she thanked them and walked on alone into a dusk that came down purple and then black over country she did not know, the stars emerging in unfamiliar clusters above unfamiliar hills. And she found, To her own surprise, that fear had less hold on her out here in the open dark than it ever had inside a room with Thaddeus Wexler's calm voice in it. By the third day, the road had narrowed to a rutted track winding between low hills the color of a fawn's coat. And it was on that morning, with the sun still low and the shadows still long, that she came over the last rise and saw Cutter's Ridge laid out below her, a scattering of gray buildings clustered around a crossroads, a church with a leaning steeple, a mercantile, a smithy gone cold, and beyond the edge of town, up a slope grown wild with unpruned apple trees, a house with a chimney that stood taller than its roofline, dark against the pale sky like a finger raised in warning. She stood a long moment on that rise, her feet aching inside boots gone thin at the sole, and felt something in her that was not quite hope and not quite dread, only the particular stillness of a traveler who has walked far enough that turning back is no longer a real option, only a thought. She learned before she had even set down her bag that the town had gathered that same morning for a county auction of tax-forfeited properties, and that the last item on the block, the one nobody wanted, was the old Bellamy place on the hill. She followed the small crowd up the slope less because she meant to buy anything, and more because a gathering of people was the fastest way in a strange town to learn its temper, and the walk up gave her a first close look at the house itself, glimpsed in pieces between the shoulders of the men ahead of her. A steep gable roof missing shingles in patches like a mange, tall narrow windows gone milky with grime, and everywhere the slow green creep of ivy working its patient fingers into every seam the weather had already loosened. By the time she reached the yard, a stout man with a red face and a voice built for cattle sales was already standing on an upturned crate in front of the sagging porch, working through the last of his patter to a crowd that seemed more interested in mocking the property than bidding on it. The house was 2 stories, once handsome, its clapboards silvered and curling, its porch roof sunk at one corner like a shoulder dropped in exhaustion, and ivy had climbed the north wall clear to the eaves, wrapping the brick chimney in a green fist, a sight that struck Eliza, even before she knew anything of what waited inside it, as somehow more sorrowful than frightening, a good house simply left too long without a hand to tend it. Someone in the crowd called out that no sane man would sleep a night under that roof, that old Silas Bellamy had died in there alone, with the doors barred from the inside, and no mark on him, and that the house had sat empty 9 years since because everyone in 3 counties knew better than to touch it, a claim repeated with such practiced relish that Eliza suspected the man had told it 100 times before to 100 other travelers passing through. The auctioneer, half in jest and half in genuine hope of unloading the lot, called the opening bid at $5 and got nothing but laughter for his trouble. Eliza stood at the back of the crowd with her canvas bag over her shoulder and did the arithmetic that a person does when they have almost nothing. $14 would buy her walls, however crooked, a roof, however patched, a hearth, however cold, and there was not a hotel room or a rented room in that town that would give her more for the same money and let her keep enough besides to eat through the week. When the auctioneer, more in exasperation than expectation, called for any bid at all, she raised her hand and said $14, and the yard went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it has just watched someone do something it privately admires and openly intends to laugh about. A lean man near the fence, missing his hat and not his opinions, called out that she'd best hope the ghost took a liking to her, since Silas Bellamy hadn't cared much for company living. The auctioneer, perhaps out of pity, perhaps only wanting his dinner, brought his gavel down before anyone could bid against her, more from lack of competition than fairness. A heavy-set woman near the porch steps, arms crossed over a market basket, muttered loud enough to be heard that a girl who'd buy a dead man's curse for $14 had likely nowhere better to spend it, and a ripple of laughter went round the yard at that too, though Eliza noted, even as she felt the sting of it, that no one in the crowd stepped forward to bid a $15th and take the curse off her hands themselves. She counted out her $14 in coins from the folded handkerchief where she kept them, coin by coin, into his broad palm, and he wrote her out a receipt in pencil on a torn page from his ledger book. Her name's misspelled as Mercier, the price and the date beneath it, and folded it into her hand as if it were something fragile. Half the crowd was still laughing as they drifted back down the hill, but Eliza stood on the sagging porch of her own crooked house, in a town that did not know her, holding a scrap of paper that said, in a stranger's uneven hand, that something in this world, however small and however cursed, now belonged to her outright. The first 2 days taught her the shape of her new life in small, practical lessons. The well behind the house had not gone dry, only choked with 9 years of leaves and a drowned squirrel's skeleton she had to fish out with a length of wire before the water ran clear enough to boil. And she rigged a rope and bucket from a scrap of harness leather she found coiled in the barn. The roof over the kitchen still held against weather if she moved the bed frame 6 feet to the west, out from under the one place where daylight showed clean through the shingles. She ate sparingly from what she'd carried and what she could glean. A handful of walnuts still sound beneath their split hulls, a few late apples clinging high in branches nobody had pruned in a decade, sour and small but sound. It was on the second evening, as she was splitting kindling on the back step with an axe she'd found rusted but serviceable in the barn, that she first saw the old man who lived at the bottom of the hill, a narrow sun-cured figure named Abner Pruitt, who kept goats, and by his own account, had kept his distance from the Bellamy place for 9 years out of what he called plain good sense. He watched her from the fence line for the better part of an hour before he worked up the nerve, or the curiosity, to come closer, and when he did, his first words were not welcome but warning, that she'd do better to sell the lumber for scrap and sleep in town. She told him, without apology, that she did not have the money for a room in town, and that a haunted house was still a roof, and something in her flat, unfrightened practicality seemed to loosen something in him, because he came back the next morning with a jar of goat's milk and stayed to help her clear the worst of the ivy from the north wall, working in a silence that suited them both. Over the following days, that silence became a kind of trade. Her labor for his knowledge of the place, his goat's milk, and his eggs, for the use of her hands mending his sagging henhouse door. And by the end of the first week, Abner had become, without either of them naming it, the closest thing to an ally she had in that country. He was a widower himself. She learned in pieces over those early mornings, his own wife gone 11 years. And he kept the goats less for the modest income they brought than for the company for which he no longer had to find words. And Eliza came to understand that his gruffness toward the Bellamy place had never really been superstition, so much as grief wearing a more convenient mask, a way of explaining why he had let a good man's house sit empty and untended on the hill above his own fence line for 9 long years without once climbing up to see whether anything of Silas Bellamy's could still be saved. It was Abner who first told her the fuller story of Silas Bellamy, an orchardist like her own father, who had built the house 40 years before with his own hands and planted the orchard that had gone to riot on the slope above the road, and who had died alone inside it 9 years past under circumstances the county coroner had ruled natural but the town had never quite believed. Mostly, Abner admitted, because folks needed a curse to explain a good man's bad luck. And it was easier to blame a ghost than to ask hard questions about who had profited from Bellamy's death. It was that last remark, tossed off almost carelessly, that lodged itself in Eliza's mind and would not leave it. She began, in the evenings after her chores were done, to walk the house room by room with a stub of candle, running her hand along the walls the way her grandfather had taught her to run a hand along a plank, feeling for what did not belong. She found nothing in the floors, which were sound oak, well laid, and nothing in the walls of the front rooms, which held together with the same honest joinery she recognized from her grandfather's own work. But the chimney troubled her from the first night she slept beneath it, not because of any sound or chill, but because its proportions were wrong, wider at the base by nearly a foot than any chimney needed to be to draw a fire, wider, she began to suspect, than any chimney needed to be for any reason except to hide something inside its bulk. She did not tear into the chimney that first night, or even that first week, because she had grown up around masonry enough to know that a wall opened carelessly is a wall that falls, and a chimney cracked wrong can bring a whole gable down with it. Instead, she spent 2 full days simply studying it, the way her grandfather had taught her to study a board before she ever put a blade to it. She scraped away the soot and grime of the firebox with a rag and a bucket of water carried up from the well, and in the scraping she found, low on the inside face of the flue, a seam in the brickwork that ran crooked where every other course ran true. 4 courses of brick set slightly proud of the wall around them, mortared in a paler, newer-looking lime than the rest. She pressed her palm flat against the seam and felt, or thought she felt, the faintest give where solid masonry should have offered none. A small tremor of possibility that kept her circling back to that same spot for 2 full evenings before she trusted it enough to act on it. On the 3rd day, she began the actual work, and it was slow, deliberate work. Nothing like the wild tearing down the town gossip might have imagined. She built a small fire in the box first, just enough to dry out the old mortar and drive off the worst of the damp that had crept in over 9 winters, and let it burn low through a morning while she worked at the outer edges of the loose brick with the flat of a cold chisel. Not her grandfather's bench chisel, which she would not risk on stonework, but a mason's tool she found rust-spotted in the barn, and spent an evening filing back to a working edge, drawing it again and again across a whetstone in slow, even strokes until it caught the light along a true bevel. She worked with a canvas sheet spread beneath her to catch the falling dust and mortar crumbs, and she learned quickly that old lime mortar, unlike the harder cement mixes she had seen used on newer chimneys, gave way in dry, chalky flakes rather than sharp fragments, a small mercy that saved her hands more than one raw scrape over those 3 days. She kept a bucket of water at her elbow to dampen the worst of the dust, and a rag tied over her nose and mouth against the fine white powder that hung in the close air of the chimney breast, and more than once she stopped simply to rest her wrist, which ached by the 2nd day, with the particular deep ache of muscles, asked to do fine repetitive work rather than a single hard effort. She worked the chisel into the seam a fraction of an inch at a time, tapping it home with a wooden mallet, in short, controlled strokes, listening with her whole body, the way Obadiah had taught her to listen to wood, for the particular hollow give that meant a joint was ready to yield, rather than the dead resistance that meant she was fighting solid stone. She marked her progress each evening in pencil on the back page of the auctioneer's receipt, a habit she did not fully understand herself until later, saw some instinct toward keeping her own honest record the way Silas Bellamy once had it, a small ledger of labor set against whatever ledger of lies had once been kept about his family. The first brick came free on the afternoon of the 3rd day, dropping into her waiting palm with a puff of pale dust and a smell like old paper and cold ash, and behind it, where there should have been nothing but the packed rubble core of the chimney, there was instead a black gap, a cavity built deliberately into the heart of the stack, and past the reach of her fingers, something that did not feel like stone at all. It took the better part of another day to widen the opening enough to reach inside without risking the whole face of the chimney, working brick by brick, each one eased free with the same unhurried patience, each gap shored temporarily with a scrap of board so the weight above would not settle wrong while she worked. A precaution her grandfather had drilled into her so thoroughly that she found herself murmuring his old warnings about unsupported spans under her breath as she worked, half instruction, half comfort. When at last her hand closed around what lay inside, it was not treasure in any glittering sense, no coin, no jewelry, but a Japan tin document box, its corners gone soft with rust, wedged into a niche that had been built, she understood now, at the same time as the chimney itself, mortared into the original construction by a man who had wanted something hidden, and had wanted it hidden well. The box was heavier than its size suggested, cold in her hands, even through the warmth of the kitchen, its black lacquer finish gone dull and flaking at the corners where 9 winters of trapped damp had done their slow work. She carried it down to the kitchen table and sat with it a long while before she found the nerve to work the corroded clasp loose with the tip of her grandfather's chisel. The first time she had let that particular tool touch anything but wood, and inside, wrapped in a sheet of oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, she found a leather-bound ledger, a folded deed with a broken wax seal, and a letter, its ink faded to the color of weak tea but its hand still legible, addressed to whoever might one day find it. The letter was signed Rebecca Bellamy, and it was dated some 14 years before Eliza was born. In a season, Rebecca wrote, when she feared her husband would not live to see the spring, her hand growing visibly more hurried and less steady toward the letter's final pages, as though written in more than one sitting, snatched in whatever quiet moments a frightened household could spare. Eliza read it slowly, once by the failing daylight through the kitchen window, and a second time by candle, because the hand was cramped and the paper worn soft at its folds, and because what it said asked to be read more than once before its full weight could be believed. Rebecca wrote that her husband Silas had built the orchard from raw hill ground with his own labor, and had for years partnered his crop and his modest savings with a neighboring man, a surveyor and sometime moneylender named Josiah Wexler, who had helped finance the planting of the upper acreage in exchange for a quarter share of the yield, an arrangement set down honestly enough in a partnership deed the two men had signed before witnesses. But a hard frost had ruined 2 seasons running, and Josiah Wexler, Rebecca wrote, had come to Silas not as a partner sharing a loss, but as a creditor demanding a debt. Presenting a second document, a note Silas swore he had never signed, claiming the whole of the orchard as forfeit against monies, Josiah alleged he was owed beyond his rightful share. Silas had refused to sign the note over, certain the signature on it was not his own, and within the month, Rebecca wrote, strange things began to trouble the household. Cattle found loose in the night, a barn fire that took the Haze store, but mercifully not the animals. Whispers carried through town that the Bellamy place was cursed, unlucky, best avoided. Whispers that Rebecca was certain had been planted and watered by Josiah Wexler's own quiet hand, because a haunted man makes a desperate seller, and a shunned family has no neighbors willing to stand as witnesses on its behalf. Rebecca wrote that she and Silas had hidden the true partnership deed, the honest one, along with Josiah's own ledger, which Silas had managed to copy from in secret during a visit to the man's office on the pretext of settling accounts, a ledger that recorded in Josiah's own hand the forged note and a payment he had made to a hired man to set the barn fire. She wrote that they dared not bring it before a county judge who owed his seat to Josiah's backing, and so they had sealed it, instead into the chimney Silas himself had built, trusting that truth kept safe outlasts a lie kept loud, and that someday, to whatever soul came to stand where they had stood, the paper would speak what they themselves had been too afraid, or too outmatched to speak aloud. The last lines of the letter named an heir, not by blood but by intention. Rebecca wrote that should neither she nor Silas live to see justice done, she asked whoever found this letter to see that the truth reached a girl named Hannah Pruitt, orphan daughter of the Bellamy's own hired hand, who had been born on the place and ought by right and by kindness to inherit whatever good the truth could still do, since blood had failed to protect her and perhaps honesty still could. Eliza sat a long while with that name in the candlelight, because it was not a stranger's name at all. Abner Pruitt, the goat keeper at the bottom of the hill, had mentioned more than once, in his roundabout way, a granddaughter he was raising alone, since her own parents had died young, a quiet, watchful girl of perhaps 12 who helped him with the goats and had never, so far as Eliza had seen, spoken more than a dozen words in her presence. The ledger itself, when she turned to it, was written in a different, more clipped hand. Columns of figures and notations that meant little to her at first glance, until she matched dates against the letter, and understood she was looking at Josiah Wexler's own private accounting, page after page of small, careful entries, recording seed loans and harvest shares for half a dozen families, whose names she did not recognize, ordinary business until, near the middle of the volume, the entries concerning the Bellamy orchard began. Columns that did not balance against the honest partnership deed, no matter how many times she added them, a debt invented from nothing, and, in a hand grown careless with confidence, a line recording $10 paid to one Tulhaney for services regarding the Bellamy barn, dated 3 days before the fire Rebecca had described. And there, folded last of all inside the oilcloth, was the honest deed itself, the true partnership agreement between Silas Bellamy and Josiah Wexler, its language plain and its signatures. When Eliza held it beside the auctioneer's own receipt for comparison of hand, unmistakably different from the note that had ruined Silas's name, the loops and slant of Josiah's true signature, nothing like the cramped, hurried scrawl on the forged note, a difference so plain once set side by side that Eliza wondered how any judge shown both together could ever have doubted it. Proof, if proof still mattered after so many years, that the man who had swindled the Bellamy orchard from its rightful owner and the man who had swindled the Mercer orchard from her own father shared more than a surname. Josiah Wexler, she understood now, turning the ledger's brittle pages by candlelight, was Thaddeus Wexler's own father, and whatever cold, careful cruelty she had watched settle over her family's kitchen table in Hollow Creek had not been born new in that room. It had been inherited, practiced first on a dead man's chimney and a grieving widow's silence, and passed down like a family trade from a father who forged a note to a son who called a forged debt a formality. She sat with that recognition a long time, turning it over the way she had once turned a board over in her grandfather's workshop, looking for the grain of it, and understood at last that the calm, unhurried cruelty she had mistaken for something particular to Thaddeus Wexler was in fact an inheritance every bit as real as her own chisel, passed hand to hand not through affection but through method, a family trade in taking that had simply never before met a family trade in building patient enough to undo it. Word travels strangely in a small county, and it was not a week before whispers reached Cutter's Ridge that the girl who had bought the cursed Bellamy place had been seen carrying brick dust out to the yard and had lit fires in that chimney 3 nights running, and the town's imagination, always hungrier for a ghost story than a land dispute, supplied its own explanations before Eliza had said a single word to anyone but Abner, some claiming she had woken Silas Bellamy's restless spirit, others insisting more plainly that she was simply mad, a rumor that troubled her far less than either the curse story or the truth she was still carefully protecting. A man named Curtis Renner, who ran the mercantile and, as it happened, held note of his own with the Hollow Creek Bank's regional office, came up the hill uninvited one afternoon to inform her, not unkindly but firmly, that the county would take a poor view of a stranger digging into a dead man's home, curse or no curse, and that she would be wise to leave well enough alone before she stirred up trouble neither she nor the town could afford. Eliza understood, listening to him, that his concern was not really for her, or even for the dead, but for the bank's good opinion of him, and that fear of Wexler's reach had crept even into a mercantile 2 counties removed from Hollow Creek, which told her more about the size of the man's shadow than any ledger could. Renner mentioned, almost in passing, that his own note with the regional office had been renewed twice already at terms he privately thought unfair, and that a man in his position could not afford to be seen standing beside anyone the bank might come to view as trouble. A small confession that told Eliza more about how far Josiah Wexler's methods had traveled, passed down and outward through his son's own dealings, than any accusation she might have made herself, and she thanked him for his honesty all the same, understanding that fear, too, could sometimes be a kind of gift when a man was brave enough to admit to it. She did not show Renner the letter. She had already begun to understand, turning Rebecca Bellamy's words over in her mind through sleepless nights, that the temptation waiting at the bottom of a discovery like this one was to run straight to a judge, to wave the forged note and the honest deed in the nearest courtroom, and demand the world make itself right in a single dramatic afternoon, and that such a path, however satisfying to imagine, was also the surest way to see the whole matter buried a second time by men with more money for lawyers than she would ever possess, and Wexler's own son sitting comfortably at the center of it, protected by exactly the kind of paper armor his father had first forged. Renner's visit was not the last warning she received that season. Some weeks later, a man she did not recognize, better dressed than most who traveled that road, arrived at the foot of the hill in a hired trap and asked Abner, who happened to be at his gate, for directions to the Bellamy place, saying he represented interests connected to the county's land records, and wished to inquire about certain irregularities that had reportedly been discovered there. Abner, without quite knowing why beyond a farmer's old instinct for a man who smelled of trouble, told him the road was washed out past the second bend and sent him back down toward town, buying Eliza's an evening's warning before the man found his way up regardless, 2 days later, and stood in her dooryard asking pointed, careful questions about brick dust and old papers, questions she answered with equally careful vagueness, admitting only that she had done some repair work on a chimney in poor condition and offering him nothing more concrete to carry back to whoever had sent him. He left unsatisfied, and Eliza understood from the visit that word of her work had already begun traveling further than she had hoped, faster and further than she had any way of controlling, and that whatever plan she built from here forward would need to move faster still than the rumor already moving ahead of it. There was a night, not long after Renner's visit, when she sat at the kitchen table with the forged notes language copied out in her own hand beside the honest deed, comparing the two by candlelight until her eyes ached, and felt for the first time since Hollow Creek a hot, sudden wave of anger rise in her chest, an urge to ride straight to the county seat and lay every page before the first judge she could find, and demand the world answer for what had been done to two families a generation apart. She let herself feel it fully, sitting alone in that kitchen, because her grandfather had never taught her that anger was shameful, only that it was a poor foreman, quick to start work it could not finish well. By the time the candle had burned down another inch, the heat of it had settled into something steadier, and she found herself instead turning over the shape of a different plan, one built the way Obadiah had taught her to build anything worth building, joint by joint, tested before it was trusted, so that when it was finished, it would hold not because anyone believed in it, but because it could not easily be pulled apart. She thought of her grandfather's chisel, of his voice telling her that a joint forced never holds as true as one worked patiently, and she began instead, in the quiet of those difficult evenings, to plan a different kind of restitution altogether, one that would not need a judge's gavel to be real. She did not go to a judge, and she did not write a single word to a newspaper, though the thought crossed her mind more than once in the dark hours before sleep. She had watched, in her own short life, what happened to families who tried to fight paper with outrage, and she had come to believe, with a certainty that felt older than her 20 years, that a scandal loud enough to satisfy her anger would also be loud enough to give Josiah Wexler's son time and cover, to bury the evidence a second time, to call her a grief-addled girl inventing ghosts, to excuse a squatter's claim, to turn the whole county's sympathy against her before a single dollar of the old debt could be undone. What she wanted was not a courtroom's verdict, but a quiet, irreversible unmaking of the lie itself, done in such a way that no lawyer could later argue it away. She went first to Abner, and through him to Hannah, the granddaughter Abner had raised alone, and she read them both the letter by lamplight in Abner's own kitchen, and watched a 12-year-old girl who had never known she had any claim on anything at all sit very still and very straight, while the truth of her own name was finally spoken aloud in a room that believed it. Abner wept quietly and without shame, the first time Eliza had seen him do so in all the months she had known him, and said only that he had promised the girl's dying mother he would keep her safe, never once imagining safety might one day arrive folded inside a dead man's chimney. It took Eliza the better part of 3 weeks after that evening to find the right clerk to trust with the filing, riding twice to the county seat and once to a neighboring county entirely before she was satisfied she had found a man, a quiet recorder of deeds named Mr. Halloway, whose ledgers she examined as carefully as she had once examined Josiah Wexler's own, and who owed no favors and no debts to the Hollow Creek Bank or any of its branches. Halloway read the honest partnership deed twice through without comment, held it up once to the window light to study the paper itself and the age of the ink, and finally set it down and said only that he had recorded stranger claims with far less proof behind them, and that he saw no reason a filing so plainly documented should wait on anyone's permission. Eliza did not hand Hannah the deed and walk away satisfied with her own good deed done. She sat with Abner and with Halloway himself, and together they filed the honest partnership deed properly, formally, under Hannah's name as Silas and Rebecca Bellamy's intended heir, a filing that required no accusation against anyone living. Only a plain record of a debt that had never legally existed, and a title that had always, in truth, belonged elsewhere, recorded in ink as permanent and as patient as anything Obadiah had ever taught her to build. She used what remained of the small, careful sum she scraped together from selling salvaged lumber and the first sound apples of that overgrown orchard to pay, quietly and without ceremony, The outstanding debts 3 families in Cutter's Ridge owed to the same regional bank office that answered, at the far end of its ledger, to Thaddeus Wexler himself, debts small enough that their sudden, anonymous settlement drew no attention beyond a puzzled clerk's shrug, but large enough that when the bank's auditors finally came to reconcile the branch's books against Josiah Wexler's original ledger entries, entries Eliza had, through the same discreet clerk, arranged to have quietly compared against county land records. The discrepancies between what the bank claimed it was owed and what it had actually ever been legally entitled to began to surface not as scandal, but as accounting error, the kind of slow, grinding, paperwork erosion that eats a careful man's reputation from the inside without ever once making the newspapers. She heard months later and secondhand from a traveling peddler who passed through Cutter's Ridge with news from 3 counties over that the Hollow Creek branch had undergone a quiet change in management, that its longtime land agent had been reassigned to a distant office with considerably reduced authority after an internal audit turned up a pattern of discrepancies between recorded debts and the underlying county filings. Discrepancy severe enough to trouble the bank's own directors, but never severe enough, carefully as Eliza had arranged it, to point at any single accuser they might move against. Thaddeus Wexler had been quietly relieved of his post by the bank's board. Not disgraced, not arrested, simply and coldly set aside the way he himself had once set aside a grieving daughter. His own methods turned back upon him by the very institution that had trained him in them, and Eliza found she felt no triumph in the hearing of it, only a settling, the particular quiet that comes when a debt long carried is finally fully paid. The winter that followed was the first in 9 years that smoke rose steady and welcome from the chimney of the Bellamy Orchard House, and the town that had once laughed at her purchase began, in small and unremarkable ways, to treat her less like a curiosity and more like a neighbor. Curtis Renner, who had once climbed the hill to warn her off, sent his boy up one October morning with a sack of nails and a length of new rope. No charge, he said, for a woman fixing up a place the whole town had been ashamed to look at. A widow named Sarah Doss, who ran the boarding house at the crossroads, began sending up a covered dish every second Sunday, more than Eliza could eat alone, until she started sharing it with Abner and Hannah, who by then had taken to climbing the hill most evenings to help her prune the wild orchard back into something like order, the girls' silence slowly giving way, over shared work and shared meals, to a steady, curious kind of talk. When old Tulhaney's widow, the same hired man whose $10 had once bought a barn fire, came to Eliza's door, one raw spring morning, asking timidly whether the girl might spare an hour to look at a hinge that had come off her gate, Eliza went without a second thought and mended it, and never once mentioned her husband's name or the ledger entry that bore it, because whatever debts belonged to the dead, she had decided, were not hers to collect from the living, who had already suffered enough for another man's choices. She repaired the Pruitt henhouse a second time, properly this round, dovetailed rather than nailed, the way Obadiah would have insisted it be done if it was to be done at all, and taught Hannah, in the doing of it, the same slow, listening patience with wood that had once been taught to her on an upturned crate by a stove that no longer existed in a house that was no longer hers. When the schoolhouse at the crossroads lost half its front step to rot, Eliza spent a Saturday replacing the tread herself, choosing a length of seasoned oak over the cheaper pine the schoolmaster offered to pay for, refusing the coins he tried to press on her, saying only that she remembered too well what it was to have no one offer the same kindness when she needed it. By midsummer, the lean man who had once called out at the auction that she'd best hope the ghost took a liking to her was the same man who brought a crate of young pear saplings up the hill, muttering something about a debt owed for a laugh he now regretted, and helped her set them along the fence line without either of them mentioning the auction again. Even Curtis Renner's wife began stopping at the orchard on her way to market, less for goods than for company, and the 2 women fell into an easy habit of trading news and cuttings from Eliza's slowly recovering trees. By that first full autumn, the orchard had produced its first proper harvest in a decade, enough sound fruit that Eliza was able to press cider alongside Abner in a borrowed press, and she gave away a